All right, here in this video, we're going to look at the rectangular coordinate system and plotting our points, and we're also going to look at the midpoint formula. So if we start over here, we have our rectangular coordinate system, which is made up of a horizontal axis here, which is going to be our x-axis, and we have a vertical axis, which is going to be our y-axis. And that allows us to locate a point anywhere within this system. For example, we would start with our x-coordinate. That's always going to be your first. So we could, for example, go over some distance to the right on the x or some distance to the left. Of course, going to the right would be positive, going to the left would be negative. And for the y-axis, that means we could go up in a positive direction, or if we're going down, we would be going in a negative direction. So the first point here, right in the very middle, this is called the origin because that's where we're going to start anytime we're going to plot a point. So that's where everything's going to originate from, is at this location. And at the origin, your x-coordinate is obviously 0, your y-coordinate is 0. So therefore, we're not moving left or right, we're not moving up or down. So for example, if we wanted to go to the right, we could count over, let's say if we went over 3 places here, and then we went up 2, that would give us this point here, and that would give us the point for your x would be 3, 2. We went over 3 on the x, and then we went up 2 on the y-axis. And notice here with your x and y-axis, we're going to divide this into 4 quadrants, which we will label with Roman numerals. And we're going to start in the upper right, and this would be quadrant 1, and then we would have quadrant 2, 3, and 4. And you'll notice that we start in the upper right hand corner and then we go around in a counterclockwise direction in labeling our 4 quadrants. So there's kind of the basics of plotting your points. Again, realize that your x is always first, your y is always second. So let's see if we can plot the points over here. If I give you point A, which is the point 2, 3, can we plot this on our x and y axis? So keep in mind, this is your x, this is going to be our y axis. Well, this says that we're going to start and go over 2, and then we're going to go up 3 units. So that's our point here. Okay? So now, what if I give you a second point, B, and I want you to find the coordinates for -1, 2? Well, in this case, our x is negative, so if we start from the origin, this time we're going to go 1 unit to the left, and then we're going to go 2 units up, and we would have point B. All right, if we have point C, -3, -4. So again, our x is negative, so we're going to go 3 to the left. And then -4 says we're going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, and that will give us our other point for point C. And if we have another point D, which is 4, -2, our x is positive, so that says we're going to go 4 to the right. And then we're going to go down 2 because the y is negative, so we would count down 2, and there we would have point D. And then if we look at having point E at 2, 0, where's that going to be located? Well, our x is 2, so we're going to go 2 to the right, and notice our y is 0, so that means we're not going to go up or down, so our point is right here. So this point really doesn't fall in one of the quadrants, whereas point A is quadrant 1, B is in 2, C is in quadrant 3, D is in quadrant 4. Point E falls on the x-axis. And if we have another point F, let's say that it is 0, -3, then that means our x is 0, so we're not going to go left or right. We're simply going to go down 3 units on the y, and there our point will be on the y-axis. Okay, so there's an example of plotting points. All right, now I'm going to see if we can figure out, we want to find the quadrant of our given point. for example, if I said that our x value is greater than 2 and our y coordinate is less than a -1, where is that going to be located? Well, if we look at our x and y axis, here's our x, here's our y, and we know that x is greater than 2. Well, if that means x is greater than 2, if we go over on the x, here's 2 on the x-axis. Well, for greater than 2, then that means that we have to be to the right. So we could be over here to the right of 2, and then we're told that y is less than -1. Well, if we figure out where -1 is on the y-axis, then we're going to go down -1. And if we're less than -1, that means we're here going somewhere below -1. So where does that fall? Which quadrant must we be in? Well, if we look, if we're to the right of 2 and we're below -1, then that means we must be in the fourth quadrant. All right, see if you can figure this one out. You may want to pause the video and see if you can determine where this quadrant is. If x times y is greater than 0. Okay, now once again, pause the video, and before you do that, keep this in mind. You're multiplying x times y, and you need to keep in mind what are the rules for multiplying positive and negative numbers, and see if you can determine which of the four quadrants this point must be located if x times y is greater than 0. All right, so hopefully you were able to pause the video and you were able to come up with an answer. So let's see if you came up with the correct answer. Well, first of all, if we think about multiplying x times y, we know that in order to have x times y to be greater than 0, basically we're saying that the product must be positive. Well, if product is positive, then that means that when you multiply x and y, they must have like signs. So if we're in the first quadrant, then that means your x coordinate is positive and your y coordinate is positive. If we're in the second quadrant, that means our x coordinate is negative, our y coordinate is positive because we're going to the left and up, so it's negative and positive. If we're in the third quadrant, again, we're going to the left, so that's a negative x, and we're going down, so that's a negative y. And in the fourth quadrant, we're going to the right, so that's a positive x, but we're going down, so that's a negative y. So now, if we were to multiply positive times a positive, your answer would be positive. So therefore, it's greater than 0. So our point, if we take x times y is greater than 0, our point could certainly be in the first quadrant. Could our point be in the second quadrant? Well, negative times a positive is negative, so therefore that is less than 0, so it could not be in the second quadrant. What about the third quadrant? We have a negative x and a negative y. Well, negative times negative is positive, so therefore that is greater than 0, so our point could be in the third quadrant. And if we check the fourth quadrant, once again we have opposite signs, so therefore it's going to be negative. So if you're in the second or fourth quadrant and multiplying, you're going to end up with a negative value, which would be less than 0. Okay, now we're going to move on to looking at what's called the midpoint formula. So here we want to find the midpoint between 2 points on a line segment. So for example, if we start with point A, and we'll say that is at 1, 3, so that means we're going to go to the right 1 and then count up 3. So there's point A. And if we're going to point B, which we'll call that -3, 3, so that means we're going to go to the left 3 units and then up 3 units to point B. And we want to find what is the midpoint, and I'll call this M. What is going to be the midpoint? Now, we could look at this and we could certainly just count and kind of figure, because A and B are straight across from each other, we could certainly count and we could say, well, the midpoint, if we got from A to B, we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, so it looks like the midpoint we could certainly count is going to be right here. Okay, and we could say, well, if that's the midpoint, then we're going what? Over 1 to the left and then up 1, 2, 3. So it looks like the midpoint is going to be located at -1 for the x and then up 3. Now that's nice if we can have a nice horizontal line segment here connecting from A to B to find this distance. But what happens if our points are located differently? Well, what have we actually done here? Well, if we think of this as the midpoint formula, we're taking and finding the midpoint, the center here. Well, the formula tells us that we can find the midpoint by taking our x-coordinate and adding it to the x-coordinate of the other point. So we're going to call this x1 plus x sub 2. And basically what we're saying is we're taking the, let's say, we'll call this x1 and this x2. I'm sorry. We'll call this point x1 and y1. And then down here we can call this point x2 and y2. So we want to add our x's together. So x1 and x2. And because we're looking for the midpoint, we're going to divide that by 2. That'll give us our x-coordinate for the midpoint. And then we can take our y-coordinates, y1 plus y2, divide that by 2, and that'll give us the y-coordinate for the midpoint. So this is our formula that we're going to use. So here we would have x1 plus x2, so we're simply going to take our x1, which is 1, plus x2, which is a -3, and divide by 2. And then our y1, which is 3, plus our y2, which is 3, and divide that by 2. So 1 plus a -3, we would end up with a -2, and a -2 divided by 2 is a -1. 3 plus 3 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And you'll notice that gives us our midpoint. So if it's not something we can actually visually count, we can simply plug into the formula to calculate the midpoint. So if we look at another example here, let's say that I give you the point 2, 1. So we're going to go to the right 2 and up 1. And our second point is -4, 3. So that means we're going to go to the left 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 1, 2, 3. And we want to find the midpoint here. What is going to be the midpoint? Now this one we really can't count, because if we're looking at the midpoint, we know that if we look at the line segment here, we can kind of guess where the midpoint's going to be, but it may be a little hard to find not knowing exactly where this is going to be located, the center of this line. So we could certainly go to our formula again, and that says we're going to add our x values. So we're going to take 2 plus a -4 divided by 2. Take your y values, 1 plus 3, and divide by 2. Well, 2 plus a -4, we get -2 over 2. 1 plus 3 is 4 divided by 2. So we end up with -1, 2. So -1, 2 is our midpoint. Well, if we find that point, we're going to go 1 to the left and up 2. And we can see that looks about where our line would cross at -1, 2. So keep in mind here with your coordinates, your x value is always first, your y value is always second, and your quadrants start in the top right, and you number those 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we looked at the midpoint formula. You simply add your x values together, divide by 2, add your y values together, and divide by 2.